everybody. Welcome back to another installment of TPR Live. This is our second of 3 weeks we have gearing up for that January 26th PSAT that is coming up later this month. Thank you all for tuning in. I've got a question for you before we get started today, and that is, were you here last Thursday? Did you watch our PSAT overview this a week ago today? Because if not, I will review some of the big picture PSAT stuff that we covered last time. But if most of you were here, then we can skip right to it and get to some test taking strategies. So I want to cater to the people that showed up and want to give your time to learning some tips and tricks about the PSAT today. So I'm super curious to see who's here and who's maybe caught up with last week or not. But I just want to thank you all for coming. This PSAT is just this weird little test. It feels very important for the time that you have to think about it and maybe prepare for it and take it. But then once it's over, that's kind of it, right? You don't put that PSAT score on any college applications, and it'll kind of slip your mind as the years go by. I promise you, I took the PSAT a long time ago. I couldn't even begin to tell you what my score was. And that'll be the case for a lot of you as well. So I just want to talk a little bit about the context of why the PSAT matters, and share some tips and tricks and help those of you that are taking it later this month kind of do the best you can and understand the context of it. And it looks like we've got nobody that was here last week. That's wonderful. So welcome. Thank you guys all for showing up. Love to see new faces here joining us. And so we'll go ahead and cover some of that stuff that we talked about last week. So give some big picture idea to the PSAT before we go into some strategies. And then just a reminder, we'll be here same time next Thursday, and we'll just be doing some PSAT practice problems, talking about strategies for different types of problems that you'll see on the test. So I'm so happy to see you all here today, and let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about basically what is the PSAT. We're going to talk about some general test taking strategies that you can use on the PSAT, but also on some other multiple choice tests that might show up in your life. And then we'll talk about some PSAT specific strategies here at the end, and we'll actually do a few sample problems together. My name is Kelsey. I'm an outreach specialist with the Princeton Review. I also teach and tutor for the SAT, the ACT, the GRE, and part of the MCAT. So my whole world is kind of standardized testing, which for a lot of people, I get apologies when people hear that, right? They're like, oh, I'm so sorry. But for me, it really is a lot of fun. I love sharing the secrets that make these tests easier to digest, easier to beat, less stressful in any way that they can. So I'm so happy to see you all here today. And when we're done, I hope that you can take away some strategies that you can use to get the score you want to get on not only the PSAT, but also on the SAT and the ACT. And as we move on, some of those tests that do have a bigger significance in getting into the colleges of our dreams, right? That's what this is all about. So first up, we're going to talk about what the heck is the PSAT. The most important thing to know about it is it's the preliminary SAT, and it can also be used to qualify you for the National Merit Scholarship. You can usually take it just once a year. So this is usually in October, but as we all know, this has been a pretty weird year. So there's also a January test date. And so that's probably in the future for some of you that are here today. Or perhaps you're just thinking way ahead to taking it again in October of 2021. And so your school is going to be the one to decide when it will be. So if you're not sure, your school counselors will know. And so it might seem weird that this is a test that's only offered once a year when, the SAT and the ACT are offered several times a year. So why would the real SAT, the one that counts on those college applications, be offered enough times for students to take it and take it and take it until they get the score that they want, and the PSAT isn't? Well, that question does make a lot more sense if you know what the PSAT is all about. So we're going to play a quick little game of true and false. I'd love to tell you that there are no wrong answers, but there are. But we're going to talk about some of these issues because these are the wrong answers that we see again and again. And I'm sure that you've heard some of them. And so I want to make sure that you know why they're wrong. So if you do gravitate towards a wrong answer, there's a good reason, because these myths are really widespread. So first up is, do standardized tests like the PSAT, do they measure your intelligence? Are they an intelligence test like an IQ test? What do we think about that one? That's going to be a big fat false. It does not measure your intelligence. How well you do, it has nothing to do with how smart you are, how creative you are, none of that. All it tests is your ability to take the test, how well you take the PSAT. A 1500 means you're a great PSAT test taker, and a lower score means maybe not so much. But all it is a test of test taking skills that measures your ability to take a test. That's it. All standardized tests kind of have to be that way because they're given to students all over the world who have taken different classes, they've had different teachers, and they're used to compare students with different academic skills and interests. So, not an IQ test in any way, shape, or form. Follow-up question, do PSAT scores reflect your GPA in high school? Are those two factors correlated? What do we think about that one? This is another big false, right? Think about it this way. Half of the PSAT score is math, but half of your GPA isn't math, right? That's just one class among many other classes. So if you're not particularly strong at math, you're going to have a lower PSAT score, perhaps, than you would in your high school GPA. But your high school GPA is also based on a lot more things than just tests. It's coursework, it's essays, group projects, and tests, but the PSAT, just a test. So measuring totally different things. Okay, so we've got not an IQ test, not a high school GPA measure. How about predicting your college GPA? This is, after all, a college admission test, or at least the preliminary version of it. So do we think standardized tests predict a student's college GPA? True or false? If you're picking up on a pattern here, you're right. Yeah, actually, the PSAT and SAT, all that stuff, it actually does a worse job of predicting your college GPA than reflecting your high school GPA. A worse job. Because once you're in college, think about it, you'll be able to focus on the things that you want to and that you're good at and that you enjoy in your major. So that means everybody's pretty much likely to do better in college than you've done in high school. And once we get into college, you'll be taking fewer tests than you did in high school. So test taking skills are a lot less important once you actually get into college. Final question here. Does the PSAT test what you've learned in high school? What do we think about this last one here? True or false? What's the point of this test? Is it what we've learned in high school or not? And this one, kind of the jury's still out, sort of, essentially. There's going to be things on the PSAT that you learned in high school, of course. You're going to have the Pythagorean theorem. You're going to have basic grammar principles. Some of the things on the test might be stuff that you learned well before high school. But it isn't the content that makes these standardized tests so difficult. Instead, it's the fact that these tests are so different from the way that you've been taking tests your whole lives, and particularly the tests that you're used to taking in high school. So let's take a look at what your high school tests have in common that doesn't really translate to standardized testing. Your high school tests follow a really particular pattern. They cover a limited subject matter, and it's evaluating content knowledge, how much you know about a subject. And so that's why you're usually given plenty of time to finish an exam and why your teachers want to give you partial credit or even the elusive extra credit. That's always an option in high school, right? And they can do that because your tests are graded by people, not by algorithms or computers or robots or any of that. And finally, your high school tests are just one element of your overall grade. Standardized tests like the PSAT stand in contrast, right? Cover years of material, and they jump around between the subject areas, right? Between grammar and reading and math, also going between lots of different subjects or topics within those subjects. And to succeed, it doesn't really matter what you know, but if you can kind of pace yourself through it and memorize some details. You also have to do that in a very rigorously timed setting and make sure that you just get the right answer and avoid the wrong answers because you don't have an opportunity to explain yourself, right? It's graded by a machine. And so if all of that isn't stressful enough, your score is going to be the only thing that matters at the end. And so this is why the PSAT and the SAT and the ACT and your AP exams, they're all so difficult for a lot of students. You've been learning one way to take tests for basically your entire academic life, and now you're being judged on something completely different. And so it only makes it worse that these standardized tests feel so important in college admissions. Um, Another aspect of the PSAT is going to be this National Merit Scholarship Test. PSAT is promoted as a scholarship test, but it's important to recognize that very few students actually do qualify. So let's take a look at actually what those numbers shake out to be. 1.6 million juniors across the country take the PSAT every year. And of those 1.6 million, only the top 1% will receive what's called national merit recognition, and that's just 50,000 students. So very few students are already just earning this recognition, and that's not even the scholarship. There are even fewer students among those groups who become semifinalists, just 16,000, and then 15,000 of those become finalists. Eventually, only 7,500 students across America become National Merit Scholarship recipients. So very small number of the 1.6 million juniors taking the test each year. So even if you don't win the actual scholarship money, having the recognition is of course very prestigious and it should show up on your college application. But if you don't, it's not going to hurt you. It's not going to hurt your admissions chances anywhere. So the PSAT is really, if you think about it, just a perk. If you ace it, you can win a scholarship. And if not, if it doesn't go well, there's nothing to worry about. There's no problem. It's not going to hurt you one bit. Next, we're going to take a peek at your score report from the College Board. It gives you some information, but all you can really extrapolate from your score report is how well you did on the PSAT. But still, you can know in detail how you performed on test day. So here's an example of the score report. Biggest, most obvious number we have here is going to be your total score. This is your official PSAT score. So the student here got a 960. You can also see how you did in the reading and writing and the math just below that. And it also shows how you did against some other test takers. So this can help you to understand more of what those numbers mean. So this student here scored in the 51st percentile, meaning that she's performed better than 51% of students. And it also shows how well you did against a benchmark of college readiness, whatever that means. That's a College Board measurement. We're not really sure where they get that, so don't put too much stock in those numbers when you see them. The three test scores ultimately are what determine what matters for this National Merit Scholarship. The selection index is not the PSAT score. It's a different number that's just used to determine if you qualify for the National Merit Scholarship. And the way it's calculated is they add up your reading test score, your writing and language test score, and your math test score. They add those three numbers up, multiply by 2, and that's your selection index. And it's important to remember that the National Merit Scholarships, they don't have a lot of money attached to them, but they do carry a bit of prestige. So if you do find yourself, if you take the test as a sophomore and you have a fairly high score, it might be worth actually prepping and trying to get yourself up to be competitive for the National Merit Scholarship as a junior. But again, if not, if it doesn't work out, no harm, no foul. Nothing really is lost. It's not going to hurt you. So let's talk a little bit about how the PSAT compares to the SAT in terms of content and scoring. There's quite a lot of similarities. So let's take a look at the scoring index here. There's a few different varieties of the PSAT. Each school is going to offer different versions of these, so if they don't look familiar to you, that's no big deal. But let's take a look here. We've got the PSAT 8 and 9, which has a maximum score of 1440, PSAT 10, a maximum score of 1520, and of course the SAT has a maximum score of 1600. So why are PSAT scores so different from the SAT scores? The right answer to that is that they're scored on a different scale. So the PSAT score is scored on the same rubric, but just a different higher value. So because they're scored on different scales, your total PSAT score is actually a pretty good indicator of what your SAT score would be. So a total PSAT score of 1,000 means if you took the SAT the same day, your SAT score would have been 1,000. And you might be thinking that it's weird to have a score that shows what you might have done on a different test if you had actually taken that test. But if what this shakes out to mean is that 80-point difference essentially indicates that the College Board is saying that they expect students to improve from the time you take the PSAT to the time you take the SAT. So nobody's guaranteed to improve by 80 points, but there's an expectation that there will be some level of improvement between the two exams. And here on this chart, we're going to show the similarities between the PSAT and the SAT. It's important to point out here that the content on both tests is exactly the same. They're covering the same level of material in the same order. The only real differences are this. The PSAT is about 15 minutes and 15 questions shorter than your SAT will be, and you don't have an optional essay on the PSAT. That's it. Those are the only differences. So this is really fantastic practice for the SAT. You've basically already taken the whole test under timed conditions. And so it's a really natural thing to go from having sat for the PSAT to the SAT. And just super helpful to take any preparation from one test to the other because they do have so much in common here. So that's our recap of the overview of what the PSAT is and why it might be worth preparing for. And so now we're going to go into some test taking strategies. Standardized tests are standardized, and that actually does help you. There's certain strategies out there that can help you for any standardized test, including the SAT, ACT, PSAT, AP exams. Later down the line, maybe the GRE or the LSAT or the MCAT to help you get into grad school or law school or med school. But before we talk about any specific types of questions, let's understand kind of these broader standardized test strategies. And let's take a step back and start with the things that the SAT and the ACT and the PSAT all have in common, because it's a good reminder that the general framework of a test can sometimes be the hardest part, and it's important to know what you're going to be up against on test day. Both tests have over 3 hours of testing time, and nothing anybody does ever takes that long. It's really boring. You're not going to have good breaks in between. And in addition to that, you have limited time per question. So you're going to feel the pressure of rushing basically every minute because you need to be working through each question pretty steadily. So you need to manage your time quite carefully on both the SAT and the ACT for the full 3 hours. And so these similarities aren't just things that make the test more difficult, but they can also give you an advantage, right? Both of these tests are mostly multiple choice tests. ACT is completely multiple choice. SAT math has a few kind of open-ended questions. And we can think about multiple choice questions as being quite frustrating, but they also give you a really specific advantage. If you have 4 choices, you might not be able to find the right answer right away, but I bet you can spot a wrong answer. We call that process of elimination, and you can use that on any type of multiple choice question. Both of these tests do cover similar material. They both have math, which covers math through Algebra 2 with a handful of trigonometry questions. They also both have reading sections, which require you to read some advanced passages and answer questions about them. You'll also have sections that require you to fix grammar and structure within a passage. SAT calls that writing and language. ACT calls it English, but it's pretty much the same thing. And finally, you might think there's a difference because the ACT's got that dedicated science section. But on the SAT, the reading section actually has some science passages in there, and those are really similar to ACT science. So whether you're up against the SAT or the ACT or both of those tests, you're going to have a long time sitting there. You're going to be stressed and rushing, but don't lose sight of the big picture. You can use strategies on any multiple choice test. And so the first thing you should think about when preparing for one of these tests, it isn't necessarily subject matter knowledge or strategies for particular questions. Instead, it's an overall strategy for the entire test that really gets at what makes these tests so much harder than the normal tests that we're used to taking. You should know how to pace yourself. I bet a lot of you are kind of struggling with pacing yourself on these tests because you're human and they're stressful. And so likely how you're going to approach it is like a rabbit. You're going to see 48 questions on the PSAT math, and you're going to want to charge ahead and do them all in order and speed through and try to get to the end of the section. That'll cause some issues, right? The rabbit may make some silly mistakes, get some questions wrong that under different circumstances you would have gotten right. And if the rabbit is an average math student, then this rabbit's only going to get about 22 out of the 48 questions right. And so that shakes out to be a 540 on the PSAT, or right around the 50th percentile. So, following the tortoise and the hare metaphor, instead of acting like the rabbit, perhaps we should act like the turtle. And so this is a student with a similar level of math, another average math student. But this turtle knows its strengths. It knows what types of math questions it's likely to do well on. So this turtle is only going to do the questions that it's most comfortable with, maybe spending the whole time on just 33 of the 48 questions. And that doesn't mean that the turtle is going to get all 33 of those right. This turtle is, of course, still going to make some mistakes. It's not a perfect turtle. So the turtle gets 28 out of the 33 right. And that shakes out to a 580 on PSAT math. But the turtle also guessed on the remaining 20 questions. And so statistically, based on probability, this turtle probably got 3 or 4 of those correct just by statistically guessing. And so that brings our score up even higher. 3 more points gets us to a 610. So neither the PSAT or the SAT or the ACT, none of these tests have a guessing penalty. So a blank answer is counted exactly the same as a wrong answer. They're both wrong, essentially. So you should always bubble in something. And here's another Princeton review strategy I'll give you for free. Pick your favorite letter to always guess when you choose to guess. Don't waste any brain power figuring out which one. We have all gotten into that rut, right? Where you decide you don't know how to do a question and you look back up at the previous ones on the Scantron and you think, oh no, I just did 3 A's in a row, or I haven't bubbled in B in a while. Is that a good use of your time when you're taking a standardized test that is timed? No. So pick a favorite letter, A, B, C, D, doesn't matter. Every time you decide to guess, go ahead and guess that same letter. That's going to save you from going back and trying to calculate what the answer could be. It'll let you keep moving and spend your brain power on questions that you're actually more likely to get right. So next I want to talk about another one of my favorite strategies we do here at the Princeton Review, and one of my favorite acronyms of all time. This is going to be your POOD, your personal order of difficulty. Here's how it works. You are going to have certain types of questions that you're more successful on, ones that you're more likely to get right than others. That's true for everybody, although each student has a different set of questions that they're better with. So if you identify those and do those questions first, that's your personal order of difficulty. So you're going to do better on the test if you begin by tackling the questions that you're going to succeed on. That allows you to bank all the questions that you're likely to get right early on while you're still fresh. And there's an added bonus to this too. By doing the questions that you're better at first, you're going to get more comfortable, you're going to build your confidence, you're going to feel better, and be more likely to keep your stress under control as you go through the rest of the test and maybe deal with some of those harder questions. If you go through them all in order and there's some questions at the beginning that really weigh you down and take up time and make you feel bad, then that's not going to make you more likely to get questions right going on. This is kind of a mental stress test as much as it is of content. So you want to go into it on test day knowing what questions you're going to do as soon as you see them and which ones you're going to maybe skip and come back to after you've picked up all the questions that you know how to do. There's another key similarity between the SAT, ACT, PSAT. You might not even realize this is an advantage, and you're probably already using it some way. And this has to do with the fact that it's a multiple choice test. So this advantage is that you don't always need to find the right answer. You might not even know the right answer at all, but you can still get the point. And that's through using this thing we call process of elimination. This is really, really critical on a multiple choice test. So let's see it in action. Does anybody here today know off the top of your head what the capital of Malawi is? Any guesses? No peeking? Probably not. And that's okay, because I bet you'll be able to get the answer once I show you some answer choices. So even if you didn't know that the answer was a long way, you've probably heard of some of these other cities, Paris, London, and Amsterdam. Probably also know that those are European capitals. So we can eliminate those. So we don't need to know the capital of Malawi off the top of our head, as long as you can spot what is not the capital of Malawi. Another thing that you want to keep in mind is that the test writers are deliberately trying to trick you, so you need to keep that in mind. If something looks too good to be true, it probably is. So I'm going to read a math question and let's see what we can do here very quickly. If a store raises the price of an item by 20% and then decreases the new price by 15%, what was the percent change in the price of the item? If you were thinking, duh, just 5%, that's what they want you to think, right? But if we actually shake this out and work out the math, we can see that maybe that's not going to be the fastest way to get the right answer here. So we don't know how much this item costs, just the price of an item. And so whenever you see something going up or down by a percentage and you don't know how much that thing is, then go ahead and call it 100. That's going to make the math pretty easy. So if the item is $100 and it's raised by 20%, then our new price is going to be $120. Cool. Then what? Then what happens? The 120 is decreased by 15%. Now, wait a minute. What's 15% of 120? That's going to be $18. So we have 120, we're taking away $18. That gives us a final price of $102, which is a 2% increase. So you bet your bottom dollar that 5% would be one of those multiple choice answers, but we're not going to fall into that trap. We're going to run the math fairly quickly by picking, an easy number to work with as 100 there, and roll through and not fall into that trick that they have set for you there, 2% increase. And that's why, some of the most common mistakes that can cause you to answer questions wrong are really quite simple. You're not going to miss a ton of questions because you don't know the quadratic equation or you're missing some important vocabulary. You're more likely to do some things to mess yourself up in kind of a more small but predictable way. You may just move too fast, like in that previous math question. You may be a bit careless doing work in your head, or not noticing the difference between a semicolon and a colon, even though you know the difference if you're just moving too fast that you miss it. You may also misread some problems. You may see the word increase instead of decrease and just do the math wrong. Or you could also just not understand what to do. And I don't mean here that you're not going to know a grammar rule or a math formula. It's just that you're having trouble understanding the specific task that the question is requiring you to do. And so these are just some of the reasons why it's really hard to get a perfect score or even a high score on some of these tests. And that's even more difficult kind of once you get into the weeds on some of the questions here. So we're going to move from these general multiple choice questions onto some PSAT specific strategies. We're going to do a sample question from each of the 3 sections on the test and walk through some ways that you can actually take with you to your next test and use on different types of questions here. So these are just a few simple strategies that you'll be able to use immediately. So first up is going to be our reading strategy. The College Board has boasted repeatedly it no longer wants to test students on obscure vocabulary that you'll never use. Back when I took the SAT, that was certainly their goal. So lucky you guys, but that doesn't mean that there's no vocabulary on the test. In fact, they have this specific question type. We call it words in context. So a words in context question always looks the same. It says in line something, this word most nearly means. And so here's what makes these questions tricky, even though they're not testing kind of cold vocab recall. It's a time test, remember? So you are likely to try shortcuts. And so the obvious one here is to not go back to line 5, is to just pick the word that most nearly means based on the dictionary definition that you remember. but I can promise you that one of the 4 answer choices will be a synonym that you would recognize. And so what you must do is go back to the passage and read the answer choices in place of the word in the question so you don't walk into a trap here. So we're going to go back to line 5 and find the sentence in the passage and replace the word in the question with each answer choice. So we see the word current in there. Is reflecting electric taste the same as reflecting current taste? No. What about reflecting contemporary taste? That sounds pretty close, but we want to check each answer choice here too. Reflecting charged taste doesn't make sense, and reflecting ongoing taste is not quite as strong as contemporary. So we see that contemporary is going to be the best fit in the passage. And that's the strategy you always want to use when you see a word in context question. You do not want to rely on what you remember as the dictionary definition because they're likely to use the word in a more unexpected way. So that's our trick for the writing and language, the reading section. Next, we've got writing and language. This is all about grammar. So you might approach it by trying to make sure you remember all the grammar you've ever learned. But you don't need to explain anything on this test. Isn't that beautiful? You just need to spot what's correct. And you don't have to explain why something is right or wrong. Just pick the right one. So first things first, let's read this entire question. Most students will just read the question until they get to where they have to make a decision, then they'll stop. So you may see this underlined portion and then dive straight into the answers. Test writers know this about you. And so the context here doesn't actually give us enough information to answer this question. If you've read through, the answer could be either A or C, depending on what the surrounding stuff suggests. So it's really not possible to answer this question just by having read this far. We need to know the tense of the other verbs around it. But even better, we don't need to know the rules about all the verb tenses or what every possible verb tense is. All you need to do is to watch the context. So let's take a look at what's going on here more. We see the rest of the paragraph. There's 2 other sentences with similar structures. It says that the scientist's research will redefine and that the scientist will become more famous. So we don't need to put names to what these grammar rules are. We just want to be consistent and put this other verb in the present tense or the future tense. Will continue. We just need to match it, make it consistent, and that's going to give us answer C for this writing and language example. So you might have to read beyond that particular underlined portion that takes you into the answer choices before you can actually have enough information to make a good decision there. So that's our writing and language example. Now let's take a look at math here. There's specific strategies for math questions on the PSAT, and this one's very typical. So here we have, if Claire is C years old and is 6 years younger than Alan, in terms of C, how old will Alan be in 3 years? And when you see these words called in terms of, that can let you know that we can take a strategy and use it to make this question a little bit easier to deal with. Because Claire isn't C years old. Nobody is C years old. Everybody is some number years old. So we're going to plug in a number and make Claire a specific age. You've been taught in math classes pretty much since elementary school to do all the work and never ever guess. But with multiple choice questions, sometimes you can just guess and plug in a number. So here there's just this one variable, it's C. So as long as you put in the same number for C, then that's fair game. You can do that. So we're going to say that Claire isn't C years old. We're going to say she's 10 years old. And if she's 10, then what else do we know? If Claire is C, Claire is 10, and is 6 years younger than Alan, then Alan's got to be 16 years old. So how old is Alan going to be in 3 years? What's the answer to this question? If Claire's 10, in 3 years, Alan is going to be 19, right? So that's our target answer. We're looking for something that's going to give us Alan to be 19 years old. So what did we do to even get started on this path? Well, we plugged in 10 for C. So let's do that for each of the answer choices. So if we plug in 10 for C for answer A, that doesn't give us what we want, right? That's 4. Let's try it for B. We're looking for the answer to be 19 because that's how old Alan will be in 3 years if Claire is 10. 10 minus 3 gives us 7, not quite 19. We'll try another answer. 10 plus 3, 13, closer, but not quite what we're looking for. Answer D matches up with our target. If Claire is 10, in 3 years, Ellen will be 19. That matches up beautifully with our target. So this plugging in strategy is really beautiful to help make sense and streamline and basically turn algebra into arithmetic. No matter how good you are at algebra, I promise you're better at arithmetic. And this strategy is really, really awesome for helping to just streamline and make these types of questions a little bit easier to handle. And so that's all I've got for practice problems today. Again, we'll be back same time next Thursday to do some more practice problems. But just to kind of close out here, you're not likely to remember what your PSAT score ever was once you've moved on and started taking these SAT or ACT or the test scores that you're really going to put on your college application. So your PSAT score is not the biggest deal. It does have the opportunity to qualify you for the National Merit Scholarship, but we know that very few students actually do make that. But it is a really excellent practice for the real deal SAT. So if you're taking that test, in a couple of weeks or in October or whenever, um, you can take the strategies that we learned today and use them on the PSAT and beyond to improve your chances of getting into college. So we've got some time for questions if anybody has any. You can type those in the chat and they will come back to me. But I just kind of want to wrap up and thank you all for stopping by today. Wish you all the very best of luck in your PSAT endeavors and beyond. And let us know how we can help you here. Thank you so much for your time and attention. If there's no questions, I think we'll call it. I hope y'all have a really great day, rest of your week, and 2021 in general. All right, bye y'all.